The stars were singing when he was born, though no one could hear them, and perhaps they were only singing for him. There was a certain hush in the air that night, the kind that made the world feel softer, like a whispered secret carried through the branches and across the rooftops. In the quiet of that gentle pause, life began in a way that was strange, beautiful, and slightly inexplicable. The moonlight had a slow rhythm, spilling over the edges of the window, painting silver lines across the floor. And he was there, tiny, uncertain, yet already aware in ways that would take years to understand. The house smelled faintly of bread and warm tea, ordinary things, and yet they seemed to hum with an unusual depth, as if they remembered something long forgotten. We truly love and care for you, you know. Tonight, in the soft folds of sleep and the quiet spaces between thought, we want you to feel that warmth. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now let's get started. He was never like other children, though no one made a point of saying it aloud. Sometimes, when the morning sun fell in perfect rectangles across the floor, he would trace his fingers along the light as if it were a river. He noticed things others overlooked, the faint tremor of a leaf when it quivered in the wind, the almost imperceptible change in someone's voice when they were afraid. There was a softness in the way he took in the world, a kind of quiet curiosity that made him seem fragile, yet strangely resilient. On his first walk through the garden behind the house, he discovered something that would remain with him forever. A small stone, smooth and round, sitting alone on a patch of moss. He picked it up and felt a subtle warmth pulse beneath his fingers. It was ordinary in shape, ordinary in size, and yet it felt alive, somehow breathing beneath his palm. That was the beginning of the strange and beautiful understanding he would carry for the rest of his life. That the world, even in its most mundane forms, was full of quiet magic, waiting patiently for those who would notice. His mother watched him with a gentle smile, brushing a stray strand of hair from his forehead. She did not fully understand what he saw, but she trusted it. There is an old kindness in trust, a kind that does not demand proof or explanation, and she had it in abundance. She would hum lullabies softly while he explored, songs that seemed to ripple through the air like liquid light, settling in corners and hearts alike. The melodies were simple, almost childlike, yet they carried a strange resonance, a subtle echo of memories that weren't quite his yet, but would become his over time. By the time he could speak, he had a vocabulary of observation that was unique. He would notice the difference in the way the light shifted across a wall in the morning compared to the evening, or how a shadow could stretch longer when it felt lonely. He had a tendency to ask questions that made adults pause, not because they were difficult, but because they asked the world to be still for a moment, to be considered, to be acknowledged. People sometimes laughed at him, a gentle laugh that was part surprise, part fondness, and part confusion. But in those moments he learned patience, a skill that would later define the quiet strength within him. He formed his first emotional bond with a neighbor, a girl with hair like autumn leaves and a laugh like the clink of small bells. She was fearless in a way that contrasted with his careful observation, and yet they fit together like two halves of a soft song. She taught him how to climb trees without fear of falling too hard, and he taught her how to listen to the world with more attention. Their friendship was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was steady, like a river that never rushed, carrying small treasures along with it. One afternoon, while they were sitting beneath an old oak tree, he felt a strange warmth in his chest, a feeling that was almost like breathing, almost like the slow pulse of the stone he had discovered long ago. "Do you feel it too?" he asked. She shook her head, smiling, unsure what he meant, and yet she stayed, placing her hand lightly over his. The warmth did not vanish. It spread, gentle and persistent, and he realized that this was the first of many ways he would learn to notice the unseen, the hidden currents of comfort the quiet flows of connection between hearts, the invisible threads that tied people together even when they were apart. His home was full of small rituals that shaped him in ways subtle but profound. Morning tea, shared in silence with his father, who had hands that smelled faintly of wood and ink, teaching him that presence can be more meaningful than conversation. Evening walks along narrow streets where the world seemed to soften into shadow and light, showing him that endings could be gentle. Even the act of watching the rain fall through the window was a lesson. Patience, reflection, and the quiet beauty of things in motion. Every ordinary act carried with it the possibility of wonder if one only paused long enough to see it. There was an early recognition of limits and tenderness within him. He learned that the world could be both harsh and soft, often at the same time, and that understanding this duality allowed a person to move through life with grace. He noticed when others were tired or uneasy, when a word of reassurance could soothe more than any grand gesture. He discovered that small acts of kindness, almost invisible to the eye, had the power to alter the day, to shift the atmosphere, to bring peace where there was tension. As the years passed, the quiet magic of his childhood became woven into the fabric of who he was. The stone he had found beneath the moss, the songs his mother hummed, the warmth of a friend's hand. These were not just memories. They were lessons, gentle and persistent, forming the foundation of his empathy, his awareness, his understanding that life is not always meant to be loud or triumphant. Sometimes the most profound moments are the ones that pass almost unnoticed, yet leave a lasting trace upon the heart even now. He often thinks back to the early mornings when the air was cool and still, when the world seemed to hold its breath. Those moments of quiet observation, when the stars hummed and the moonlight fell in silver lines, shaped his very being. He learned to see the extraordinary within the ordinary, to hear the subtle harmonies beneath the noise, to understand that love is often expressed not in grand declarations but in gentle attention, in soft gestures, in the patient act of being present. And so he grew, slowly, softly, carrying within him the strange, luminous magic of noticing. He carried the lessons of the stone, of the songs, of the friendships that whispered and lingered in the spaces between moments. There was no urgency in his growth, no sudden revelation, only the steady unfolding of awareness, of empathy, of quiet heroism. Each day was a thread, each experience a soft stitch in the tapestry of his life, forming a pattern that was not yet complete but already deeply meaningful. He would learn, in time, that life's beauty is rarely loud. It is in the hush between words, in the warmth of a hand held without speaking, in the lingering glance that says, without saying, "I see you, I am here." It is in the quiet, unexpected moments of connection, the small miracles that whisper across time, and in the gentle unfolding of days that lead us, always, to where we are meant to be. And tonight, as the stars continue to hum quietly for those who are listening, we rest in that understanding too. We rest in the knowledge that you are safe, valued, and loved. The world is strange, beautiful, and patient. Its wonders will come to you if you pause long enough to notice. And here, in the quiet space of these words, we offer you comfort, soft and unbroken, as gentle as moonlight spilling across the floor. The mornings had a slower rhythm now, stretched like honey across the sky. Sunlight pooled in the corners of his room, golden and patient, waiting for him to notice. He often lingered there, tracing the patterns of light across the floorboards, listening to the hum of the house as it woke with him. There was a kind of music in ordinary sounds, the drip of a faucet, the creak of the staircase, the soft scrape of a chair as someone shifted. Each sound was a tiny signal, a reminder that life was always moving, always changing, and that it was possible to follow its rhythms if one paid attention. He discovered, slowly, that the world was not just a collection of things to see, but a place full of small truths, each quietly waiting to be acknowledged. A fallen leaf on the path could tell a story of wind and rain. A half-closed window could carry the laughter of someone far away. These were not stories meant for others to understand necessarily, but they were meaningful in the way that a heartbeat matters even if no one listens. He began to develop a vocabulary of noticing, a subtle way of interpreting the world that seemed almost invisible, yet deeply alive. The girl from the garden was still there, her presence as constant and comforting as the soft light of early morning. Their friendship had settled into an unspoken rhythm, a quiet companionship that did not demand words to exist. She would run ahead along the path, fearless and laughing, and he would follow more slowly, observing the world in the spaces between their footsteps. Sometimes she would stop, turning to him with a look that said she understood without needing to ask. And in those moments, he felt the warmth of a connection that was steady, gentle, and profoundly sustaining. School was different now. The hallways echoed with noise, and yet he learned to find quiet pockets within the chaos. He noticed the way someone shifted in their seat when they were uncomfortable, the way a smile could mask a deeper unease. He had a particular talent for listening, for sensing the hidden currents of emotion, and this skill, subtle though it was, began to shape his relationships. Teachers noticed his attentiveness, classmates sometimes wondered at it, but it was the small, unspoken understanding between him and those who needed it that mattered most. He learned that kindness often thrived in silence, in gestures too small for the eye to immediately catch. At home, evenings were a sanctuary. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and roasted vegetables, the soft clang of pots and pans a familiar lullaby. He would sit by the window watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky and think about the tiny acts of care that tied life together. His mother would hum softly while arranging the dishes, a melody that wrapped around the room like a warm blanket. He noticed the faint smile she gave him when she thought he wasn't looking, the gentle way his father poured tea so that it did not spill over the rim. Each small motion was a quiet lesson, a reminder that attention and care could be forms of love just as profound as words. He began to understand that the world was a tapestry of small, interconnected threads. A whisper of laughter could ripple through a room. A touch of kindness could alter someone's day. He experimented with these threads, testing how attentiveness could create moments of comfort, noticing how a simple smile or a shared glance could carry weight. It was an art he practiced in silence, learning that influence need not be loud or commanding, and that even the softest gestures could leave lasting impressions. One afternoon, walking along the river with his friend, he paused to watch the sunlight dance on the water's surface. There was a fleeting shimmer, a brief ripple, and he felt a sense of wonder that he could not fully explain. It was not magic in the fantastical sense, but it was a quiet magic, nonetheless. The kind that exists in recognition, in attention, in the act of truly seeing what is there. His friend splashed water playfully at him, and he laughed, feeling the warm pulse of connection that had grown between them over the years. In these simple exchanges, he learned the value of presence, of being fully engaged in the moment, even as life continued to flow past in its own steady rhythm. He discovered a new habit around this time. He began to collect small things that resonated with him. A smooth pebble, a feather caught in the grass, a leaf that glowed with the amber of autumn light. Each item was a talisman, a reminder of the quiet beauty that existed in the world, and he kept them carefully, arranging them in a box beneath his bed. They were not possessions in the ordinary sense, not treasures to boast about, but private markers of attention, symbols of the life he was quietly cultivating. In them he saw patterns, connections, and the echo of moments that had touched him deeply. He also began to recognize the importance of listening beyond words. People spoke, certainly, but there was another language, one of gesture, of hesitation, of tone, that carried more meaning than mere sentences. He became attuned to this language, responding not only to what was said, but to the unspoken, sensing when a friend needed encouragement, when a parent needed reassurance, when the world needed a quiet hand to steady it. It was a gift, though he did not think of it in such terms. It was simply a way of being, a natural extension of his attentiveness and his care for others. Nights became a space for reflection. He would lie in bed, listening to the faint rustle of leaves outside, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of the neighborhood settling into rest. In these moments, he considered the threads of his day, the gestures and interactions that had passed almost unnoticed. He would remember a glance that lingered too long, a smile shared, a hand held in reassurance. These memories were small, delicate and ephemeral, but they carried weight, and they shaped his understanding of the world. The quiet reflection allowed him to see patterns, to understand emotions, to perceive the subtle currents that flowed between people. As the seasons shifted, he noticed the changing light, the scent of rain on soil, the gentle decay of leaves in autumn. Each shift was a reminder of impermanence, and yet also of continuity. Life moved forward, slowly and inevitably, but there was beauty in the movement, in the repetition, in the soft unfolding of days that carried both wonder and sorrow. He learned to meet each moment with openness, to embrace the ephemeral and the enduring alike, and to find solace in the continuity of care, attention, and presence. By the time evening fell, and the sky turned a deep indigo sprinkled with stars, he understood something that would remain with him for the rest of his life, that the world is full of quiet magic, but it requires patience to perceive. It is in the small gestures, the unnoticed details, the acts of listening and being present. And in understanding this, he also understood the depth of love that could exist in the ordinary. The mother who hums, the friend who waits, the world that moves gently without hurry, yet full of significance. He carried these lessons like a soft lantern in his heart, illuminating moments of connection and beauty. And tonight, as the stars whispered above and the world settled into calm, he would close his eyes with a sense of peace, a recognition that life's quiet moments were the most profound, and that attention, care, and gentle love were the most enduring forms of heroism. The mornings carried a different weight now, one tinged with quiet expectation, though not the kind that hurried the day. Sunlight slanted through the windows with a soft insistence, brushing across his skin like a whisper, and he felt it deeply in a way that was more than physical. The world had begun to reveal its subtleties, its hidden harmonies, and he was learning to move in time with them. Every sound, every shimmer of light, every flutter of a curtain in the breeze became part of a slow, unfolding rhythm, a song only he seemed to hear. It was during one of these early mornings that he first noticed the way his own presence could shape the world in ways almost imperceptible. A glance, a gesture, a word spoken quietly. Each could ripple outward, soft and persistent, touching hearts without demanding attention. He discovered that empathy was not just a feeling but an art, a careful tuning into the vibrations of others. His friend, the one with laughter like bells, sensed it too. She would pause beside him, placing her hand lightly on his arm, and he would feel the unspoken currents of care passing between them, as though they shared a secret language written in the quiet pulse of being. School had become a canvas for his observations. He could sit in the back of a classroom, and though the teacher's voice carried the same words to everyone, he could feel the underlying emotions vibrating beneath them. Some students trembled with anxiety, others swelled with excitement, and a few carried a quiet sadness so subtle it could have been mistaken for indifference. He learned to respond with small acts, a smile, a nod, a shared glance, gestures that seemed inconsequential to the untrained eye, but had the power to ease the day for someone silently struggling. These acts were not celebrated, and yet they were monumental in their quiet way. At home, the rituals of the household deepened his understanding of subtle influence. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant chime of the doorbell, the warmth of a teacup between hands. All these details became part of a tapestry that he began to weave himself, consciously and unconsciously. He noticed how adjusting the angle of a chair could make his younger sibling feel safer, how reading aloud from a worn book could soothe an anxious parent. There was no grand heroism in these acts, no triumphs sung aloud, only the steady accumulation of care, attention, and awareness. He discovered that small gestures often contained more truth than any declaration shouted from a stage. He began to perceive patterns that were not visible in the ordinary sense. Clouds drifting across the sky carried messages, or at least meanings he felt in his chest. Shadows lengthened not just by the setting sun, but by unspoken emotions. A soft sigh, almost lost in the shuffle of the day, could indicate someone's deeper need for reassurance. And with each recognition, he found a sense of quiet power. Not the power of command, but the power of influence, of soft guidance, of creating a ripple of calm in the world's occasional turbulence. His friend noticed the changes too. She would glance at him with a mixture of curiosity and awe, asking questions that were simple yet profound in their intent. "How do you notice all of that?" she would ask. He often had no words to answer, only the awareness that some things were not meant to be explained, but felt. And in that shared understanding, their bond deepened. He began to see that relationships were less about words or declarations, and more about presence, patience, and the gentle acknowledgement of each other's existence. There were afternoons when he wandered alone through the neighborhood, observing the ordinary with heightened attention. A fluttering leaf, a stray cat curled on a doorstep, the pattern of sunlight through a fence. All these details felt alive, meaningful, and part of a subtle language he was beginning to understand. It was not magic in the usual sense. It was something quieter, more profound. It was the recognition that every moment held significance if one only paused to see it, and that the world responded to the care and attentiveness of those who noticed. He also discovered the ability to extend empathy in ways that surprised even him. If a friend was sad, he could sometimes feel the tremor of it in his chest, a delicate echo that demanded acknowledgement. He would offer a hand, a word, or sometimes only a silent presence, and he noticed how the weight of sadness could lift, just slightly, in that gentle exchange. It was as though the world itself breathed in response to these acts. And he began to understand that life's quiet heroism often existed in these exchanges. Small, almost invisible gestures that carried profound impact. Even at home, the lessons continued. His mother, always patient, would watch him arrange small collections. Stones, feathers, leaves, each carefully placed, each resonant with a memory or feeling. "Why do you do that?" she asked once, curious. He only shrugged, unsure how to articulate what was in his mind. "They're reminders," he said finally, "of the way the world feels when you're paying attention." She nodded, smiling gently, and he realized that sometimes explanation was unnecessary. Presence itself was enough. He began noticing subtle changes in the people around him. The way his father's shoulders relaxed after a long day when greeted with quiet acknowledgement. The way a friend's laughter lingered a little longer when met with shared amusement. The way a sibling's hand fit perfectly into his own during a small moment of play. Each observation reinforced his understanding that the world's texture was made not just of events, but of interactions, gestures, attentions, and silences. The small threads of care, woven carefully, could create patterns stronger than any dramatic act. Evenings were particularly rich with insight. As twilight softened the edges of the day, he would sit by the window listening to the distant hum of life outside. The world seemed to exhale then, shedding the noise and confusion, revealing the underlying currents of feeling and connection. He learned to read these currents, to move gently within them, and to allow them to guide his responses to others. There was a subtle exhilaration in this awareness, not a thrill of adventure, but a deep, steady satisfaction that came from understanding the invisible harmonies of life. And yet, even with all this perception, there was humility. He knew he could not fully understand everyone or everything. The world was vast, layered, and often unknowable, and he learned to accept that. There was comfort in recognizing the limits of knowledge and power, and in embracing the quiet, patient act of noticing, of responding with empathy and care, and of leaving the rest to the gentle flow of life. It was a rhythm he could trust, a song he could follow without needing to control its course. By the time night arrived, he felt the day's quiet victories resting within him. He had listened, observed, and reached out. He had noticed the small miracles, acknowledged the subtle shifts, and allowed the world to speak to him in its patient, layered way. There was a kind of peace in this, a sense of alignment with the slow pulse of life, as though the day itself had sighed in relief, carrying a soft contentment into the night. And so, as the stars blinked awake above, scattering their gentle light across rooftops and trees, he settled into bed with a sense of satisfaction that was not loud, not triumphant, but deeply profound. There were no grand adventures today, no battles won or lost, but there was a steady thread of quiet heroism, a tapestry of attention and care that connected him to the world in ways both subtle and enduring. The evening hummed softly around him, a lullaby of recognition and presence, and he exhaled into the calm, ready to drift into sleep, carrying the soft glow of understanding and quiet wonder into the night. The afternoons began to stretch longer now, heavy with sunlight that lingered lazily across the rooftops and sidewalks. He noticed the way the warmth pooled in quiet corners, the way shadows deepened beneath the trees, and the way the air carried the scent of distant rain or freshly turned soil. Life seemed to have grown both larger and smaller at the same time, larger in the sense that the world contained more subtle layers to observe, smaller in the sense that he felt each shift, each gesture, with a precision that sometimes startled him. There was a weight and a delicacy to everything now, and he learned to move within it with care. His friend was still at his side, though adolescence had begun to pull at the edges of their days. They laughed, they argued, they lingered in quiet understanding, and yet they both sensed that change was inevitable. She remained fearless, running ahead on paths he would follow slowly, while he observed the world between their footsteps. He began to notice how her moods rippled outward, how the tilt of her head or the cadence of her voice could carry unspoken messages. He learned quietly that understanding another person fully was impossible, and yet that the attempt, the act of attentive care, could shape the way the world responded. School offered new lessons in subtlety and patience. Classrooms felt crowded, and yet he had learned to find quiet pockets within them, spaces where observation was possible. He noticed a teacher's slight hesitation before assigning a task, the subtle tension between classmates, the nervous tap of fingers on a desk. With each observation, he learned to act gently, to extend reassurance where it was needed, to remain silent where words might disrupt. He discovered that influence was not about loud declarations or dramatic gestures, but about moving through the currents of human emotion with sensitivity and respect. At home, the rhythm of care continued to shape him. Meals became a meditation in themselves, simple acts infused with attention. The sound of a spoon against a plate, the warmth of bread fresh from the oven, the subtle shift in light across the kitchen, each became a note in a larger melody of ordinary life. His father began to notice his attentiveness, the way he offered quiet help without being asked, the way he seemed to sense the unspoken needs of the household. It was a different kind of strength, one built on observation, patience, and subtle intervention, and it began to define him more than any action he might have taken publicly. He began to recognize his own abilities in new ways. Empathy had always been present, but now it seemed to deepen, expanding to include more than individuals. He noticed the unspoken rhythms of neighborhoods, the quiet patterns of streets and parks, the way sunlight fell on the same corner at the same time every day. It was as if the world itself had a pulse, and he had learned to tune into it. Sometimes, when he walked alone, he could feel the subtle moods of places, the lingering echoes of laughter or sorrow, the faint residue of joy or worry. He began to understand that he could respond to these currents, offering small gestures of care or acknowledgement that made the spaces themselves feel warmer, softer, more welcoming. His friendships evolved as well. They were no longer simply playful or spontaneous. They became layered with understanding, with recognition of what could not be said aloud. He learned to listen to silences, to hear the meaning behind gestures, to notice when a look or a tilt of the shoulder carried more than words could. In return, his friends began to trust him in ways that felt profound. They shared secrets without speaking, found comfort in his attentiveness, and discovered that his presence alone could ease tension or calm uncertainty. There was a quiet heroism in these interactions, a type of bravery that required patience, attentiveness, and humility. He also discovered moments of internal conflict, small and silent, that taught him resilience. Sometimes he misread a gesture, misunderstood a tone, or failed to notice a subtle need. In those moments, he learned to forgive himself, to acknowledge imperfection, and to continue offering care without judgment. Life, he realized, was not a series of perfect interventions, but a flow of attentiveness, empathy, and effort, each small act contributing to a larger pattern that could not be fully predicted or controlled. There was beauty in the uncertainty and in the willingness to move gently within it. One afternoon, he found himself sitting on a park bench beneath an old oak, sunlight filtering through leaves in scattered patterns. His friend came and sat beside him, silent for a long time. Then she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. In that quiet gesture, he felt a surge of warmth, a recognition of shared history and trust. It was not a grand moment, not one that would be remembered in stories or photographs, but it was monumental in its subtlety. He understood in that instant that relationships were built in these gentle, almost invisible exchanges, and that their weight was deeper than any dramatic expression of feeling. Evenings became a time of reflection and quiet discovery. He would sit by the window listening to the gentle murmur of the world settling into rest. The streetlights flickered on, casting soft pools of gold across pavement and garden, and he would watch the way shadows shifted and lengthened. He began to understand the importance of waiting, of observing, of allowing things to unfold without interference. There was a rhythm to patience, a melody of acceptance, and he learned to hear it in the spaces between moments. At times, he would wander through the neighborhood alone, feeling the invisible threads that connected people, places, and events. He noticed the way a neighbor's laughter lingered on the air, how a stray cat curled in a sunbeam as if aware of his attention, how a single feather caught in the wind could shift his mood with a subtle reminder of the world's softness. These discoveries were not dramatic, but they were profound. They taught him that life's meaning often existed in the unnoticed details, in the threads that connected moments and hearts without the need for fanfare or recognition. He also began to understand the interplay between giving and receiving attention. Just as he offered quiet care to others, he noticed when others offered it to him, the way a sibling paused beside him, the gentle acknowledgement in a friend's glance, the way a parent adjusted the space around him to offer comfort. These exchanges reinforced the idea that life was a shared experience, a rhythm of attentiveness, and that small acts of care were cumulative, creating patterns of support and understanding that endured even in absence. The nights held a new richness as well. He would lie awake, listening to the gentle sighs of the house, the distant hum of the city, the rustle of leaves outside. He began to reflect on the currents of the day, on the moments of connection, on the gestures that had passed almost unnoticed. In this reflection he found peace and purpose. He understood that life's quiet heroism was not about visibility or acclaim, but about consistency, attentiveness, and the willingness to engage deeply with the world, even when the impact could not be measured. And as sleep drew near, he would close his eyes with a sense of calm satisfaction. The world, with all its subtleties and hidden currents, was vast and often unknowable, yet he had found a place within it where he could move gently, observe keenly, and offer care without expectation. The rhythms of life, the quiet magic of attention and empathy, had become a sanctuary, and in this sanctuary he rested, ready to meet tomorrow's subtle revelations with the same openness, patience, and quiet courage that had guided him through the days past. The mornings had grown warmer, the air carrying the scent of earth and grass in a way that felt almost alive. He walked through the streets slowly, letting the sunlight brush his face, noticing how the world shifted around him. Shadows stretched long across pavement and garden, and the gentle rustle of leaves whispered secrets he had learned to hear. The quiet magic of ordinary life had become more apparent to him now, the subtle rhythm of existence almost tangible. Each sound, each movement carried a meaning he could feel in the pulse of his chest, and he moved through the world with a gentle attentiveness that seemed both natural and extraordinary. He discovered a new layer of his own abilities. Empathy had always been his companion, but now it took on a more active, almost tangible form. If someone was anxious, he could sense the trembling of their emotions and feel a subtle pull to offer comfort. Sometimes a simple smile, a soft word, or a silent presence would ease that weight, and he noticed how small acts of attention could ripple outward, changing the day for someone else. It was a quiet power, one that demanded patience and sensitivity rather than grand gestures, and he began to understand its significance in shaping the world around him. His friendships deepened in subtle ways. The girl with hair like autumn leaves remained a constant, though adolescents had begun to weave complexity into their interactions. They argued sometimes, as friends do, yet each disagreement ended in understanding, often without words. There were moments when he would notice a shadow of sadness cross her face and instinctively offer comfort, even before she recognized her own need. It was in these exchanges, so quiet they might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, that their bond strengthened. He realized that trust, empathy, and attention could create connections more enduring than any dramatic declaration of loyalty. At home, the small rituals of life became arenas for observation and care. Breakfast was a choreography of quiet attentiveness, noticing when a cup was too full, when the toast had burned just slightly at the edges, when a parent's hand lingered a moment too long over a knife. He adjusted, offered, shifted, and watched, not to control, but to create comfort. These were not heroic acts in the eyes of the world, but they held a subtle weight that grew stronger over time. He understood, in ways words could not capture, that quiet attentiveness was a form of love, steady and enduring. He also began noticing the emotional landscapes of the spaces around him. The park on the corner carried a different energy depending on the day, the weather, the people passing through. He sensed when a place felt tense, joyful, lonely, or peaceful. A swing creaking in the wind might hum with a memory of laughter. A puddle reflected more than clouds, sometimes carrying traces of small, forgotten joys. He began to respond to these subtle cues, moving gently through spaces, adjusting his presence to harmonize with them. There was a rhythm to this practice, a slow dance between awareness and action, and it brought a quiet satisfaction unlike any other. One afternoon, he encountered a stranger sitting alone on a bench. There was a heaviness in the way they hunched, a quiet sadness that seemed to cling to their posture. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he sat a few feet away, breathing with them in silence, letting his presence be a steady warmth. The stranger eventually lifted their gaze, offering a hesitant smile, and in that exchange, he felt the subtle pulse of connection ripple outward. It was not dramatic, not noticed by anyone else, yet it was profoundly significant. The act of attentive care, of being quietly present, had created a space for comfort and recognition. His growing awareness of the world's subtle layers also led him to notice patterns in human behavior. He saw how gestures could communicate volumes, a hand brushing a lock of hair, a slow blink, a shifted weight. All of these carried meaning beyond the words spoken. He learned to respond in ways that acknowledged these subtleties, offering reassurance or understanding without intruding. The act of noticing became a bridge between himself and others, an invisible thread connecting hearts through attentiveness, patience, and gentle action. Evenings carried a particular richness. He would walk along streets now familiar, watching the sun lower itself, painting the world in gold and copper. The shadows lengthened, the air cooled, and the sounds of the city softened into a distant hum. He began to understand that endings were not abrupt. They were slow, layered, and often filled with beauty if one paid attention. The act of observing, reflecting, and responding created its own narrative, a gentle story woven through ordinary moments. A quiet testament to the care and attention he had cultivated. At times, he would sit on the steps of his home, listening to the subtle sounds of the neighborhood settling into night. Footsteps passed, doors opened and closed, a dog barked once and then fell silent. He noted the rhythm, the ebb and flow, and felt a sense of connection to the larger world, even as he remained stationary. There was a satisfaction in this stillness, a recognition that his presence mattered not in dramatic displays, but in quiet acknowledgement, in alignment with the unseen harmonies that ran through life. He began to understand the power of ritual, of repeated attentiveness in creating stability and comfort. Lighting a candle at dusk, arranging small objects in a precise order, humbling himself to notice what others overlooked. All of these acts contributed to a larger tapestry of care. It was a practice of mindfulness, of empathy, and of quiet heroism. Each repetition reinforced his understanding of the world, deepened his emotional connections, and created a sanctuary of presence, both for himself and for those around him. Friendship, too, evolved through ritual. He and his companion developed small, almost imperceptible practices. A shared glance at a familiar spot, a knowing smile when words were unnecessary, a hand briefly placed on a shoulder in acknowledgement. These rituals, subtle and almost invisible, carried more meaning than loud declarations or overt demonstrations. They were proof that connection, attentiveness, and care were enduring, and that heroism often resided in the quiet, repetitive acts that stitched lives together. He also learned to accept imperfection. Not every observation was correct, not every gesture received as intended. Some moments passed unnoticed, some opportunities for connection slipped through his fingers. And yet, he realized that imperfection was not failure. It was part of the rhythm, part of the learning, part of life itself. In acknowledging limits, he found freedom, a release from expectation, and a deeper understanding of the quiet power that arose from patient attention, gentle empathy and consistent care. As night drew near, he reflected on the day's subtle victories, the small acts of kindness, the gestures that went unnoticed by most, the connections strengthened without fanfare. He understood that life's quiet magic existed not in grand events, but in the attentive moments that passed almost unnoticed, in the acts of care that left ripples in the world. His heart, now attuned to the subtleties of emotion and space, carried these reflections gently, as one carries a candle in a dark room, illuminating, sustaining, and quiet. And as he lay down to rest, the world itself seemed to exhale with him. The streets, the trees, the distant hum of the city, all folded into a soft, comforting rhythm. The quiet magic of attentive care, of subtle observation, of gentle heroism had become part of his being, a steady presence he could carry into sleep. Tomorrow the world would continue its slow, layered movement, and he would move within it with awareness, patience, and the soft, enduring power of presence. The mornings had grown cooler, carrying a scent of early frost along with the lingering warmth of sunlight. He walked slowly, letting the crisp air settle around him, feeling its subtle pulse on his skin. Each sound, each movement, each flicker of light seemed to carry a whisper of meaning, as if the world was speaking in a language only half understood, half felt, yet wholly alive. He had learned to listen with patience, to notice the quiet threads that ran beneath everyday life, and in doing so, he felt more connected than ever to the rhythm of the world. His empathy had become more intentional now. He could feel the currents of emotion around him with surprising clarity. A friend's anxiety, a stranger's unspoken sorrow, the lingering weight of memory in a room he passed through. Sometimes it was faint, a mere tremor, and sometimes it was strong, a surge that pressed gently on his chest. He learned to respond in small, deliberate ways, a smile, a touch of reassurance, a presence so quiet it almost felt invisible. And yet these acts rippled outward, changing the atmosphere, softening hearts, and creating moments of unspoken comfort. The girl with laughter like bells remained by his side, though adolescence had begun weaving its own intricacies into their friendship. They navigated these changes with subtlety, learning to communicate through glances, gestures, and quiet companionship. She taught him to embrace spontaneity, to find joy in movement and sound, while he guided her toward reflection, understanding, and stillness. Together they discovered a delicate balance, a rhythm of give and take that strengthened their bond, allowing them to meet the world with a shared sense of attentiveness and care. At school, he observed more than ever, seeing patterns that eluded others. He noticed the quiet panic behind a classmate's smile, the fleeting sadness in a friend's gaze, the way a teacher's voice carried hidden weight beneath familiar lessons. He began offering small gestures of reassurance, not to be noticed, not for reward, but because he understood the subtle power of care. A nod, a quiet word, a shared glance. These acts, almost invisible to the untrained eye, shifted the day in ways that felt profound to those who received them. Home became a space of gentle learning. He began noticing the small ways his parents expressed their own attention, the soft adjustments of hands, the quiet alignment of objects, the pauses they took before speaking. These details taught him that life's care often exists in subtle, almost imperceptible motions. The warmth of bread, the aroma of tea, the soft hum of the refrigerator, all became notes in a quiet symphony that spoke to him of patience, attentiveness, and love. He realized that heroism was often less about grand gestures and more about the steady, unobserved acts that hold the world together. He discovered the power of ritual in ways he had not before. Lighting a candle at dusk, arranging his small collections of stones, feathers, and leaves, sitting for a few moments in silence, each act became a form of meditation, a way to center himself and a quiet beacon for those around him. People may not have noticed these practices, but they felt their effects. His presence carried calm. His attentiveness offered reassurance. He understood, with growing clarity, that quiet rituals could have profound impact, offering stability in a world that often felt unpredictable and turbulent. One afternoon, as he walked through a park, he saw a child sitting alone on a swing. The child's shoulders were hunched, their gaze fixed on the ground, small hands clutching the chains. He did not rush, did not speak immediately. Instead, he sat on the nearby bench, letting his presence be steady and soft. After a while, the child glanced up, a flicker of trust in their eyes, and he nodded gently. That simple act of attentive presence created a bridge, subtle yet strong, and he understood that influence could exist without words, without pressure, without recognition. Quiet, deliberate attention was a form of kindness that endured. Evenings brought reflection. He would sit by his window, listening to the neighborhood settling into quiet. The streetlights cast pools of gold on the pavement, trees whispered in the wind, and distant voices softened into the hum of night. He reflected on the day's small act. The glances he had exchanged, the gestures he had made, the moments he had noticed and attended to. Each seemed insignificant, yet together they formed a delicate pattern, an invisible thread connecting him to others, binding small acts of care into a tapestry that held both meaning and beauty. He began noticing more deeply how the spaces themselves carried emotion. A room could feel tense, heavy with memories or unspoken conflict, or it could feel light and open, filled with laughter and warmth. He learned to move within these spaces with gentle attentiveness, adjusting his presence to harmonize rather than dominate. Even the world outside, parks, streets, alleys, carried mood. He began to feel the subtle ebb and flow, and his responses became a quiet dance of awareness, patience, and care, touching people and places in ways that were gentle, meaningful, and enduring. His ability to sense and respond to emotion became a subtle form of guidance. Friends leaned on him without knowing it, drawn to the calm steadiness he carried. People confided in him, sometimes unconsciously, trusting his presence more than his words. He discovered that quiet attention could heal small wounds, ease burdens, and create connection without drama or spectacle. His empathy had become an instrument, finely tuned, able to shift the smallest currents in ways that mattered deeply, though almost invisibly, to those around him. He also began to notice patterns within himself. Moments of impatience, distraction, or uncertainty arose, and he observed them without judgment. He learned to respond with kindness to his own emotions, to notice without forcing change, and to allow growth to unfold at its natural pace. This self-awareness strengthened his ability to care for others, reinforcing the understanding that patience and attentiveness are as important internally as externally. In nurturing himself, he nurtured the capacity to extend empathy and care more fully into the world. Friendship and connection continued to evolve with subtle rituals and unspoken understandings. He and the girl had small signals, a glance, a tilt of the head, a shift in posture that conveyed more than words. These exchanges were quiet yet profound, creating a depth of trust that was unspoken but unmistakable. The strength of these bonds lay not in dramatic confessions or grand gestures, but in the ongoing, patient practice of attentiveness, care, and empathy. Quietly woven into the fabric of each day, as the night deepened, he would lie in bed, reflecting on the currents of the day, the subtle shifts he had observed, and the quiet acts of connection that shaped the lives around him. He understood, more than ever, that the world's magic often resides in the unnoticed details, the soft gestures, and the patient, gentle responses to the needs of others. His quiet presence, attentiveness, and empathy had become a steady force, a source of comfort, and a subtle form of heroism that would carry him into the days ahead. And as sleep settled over the world, he allowed himself to rest in the knowledge that the quiet acts of care, the gentle attention, and the subtle influence he carried were enough. The world moved on, as it always did, but within it, small ripples of kindness, observation, and understanding endured. Tomorrow he would continue to notice, to respond, and to create gentle ripples of presence and empathy, carrying the soft, luminous power of quiet heroism into the new day. The mornings had begun to carry a softer light, the sun moving slowly across the sky, spilling warmth over rooftops and streets with deliberate gentleness. He walked beneath it, noticing the way each shadow stretched and contracted, the way the air vibrated with quiet life. It was a kind of attention that required patience, a stillness that felt almost like meditation. Each sound, each motion, each faint scent held meaning, and he moved through it all with a tender awareness, as if the world were a living poem and he was learning to read every line. His empathy had grown in depth and precision. He could sense the subtle tremors of anxiety or sadness in those around him, a faint pulse that whispered of unspoken need. Sometimes it was as delicate as the quiver of a leaf in a gentle wind. Other times it was stronger, like the hum of a distant bell. He learned to respond in ways that were equally subtle, a steady gaze, a soft word, a hand resting briefly on a shoulder. Gestures that carried meaning without announcing themselves. In these moments, he discovered that quiet attention could alter the emotional currents of a space, easing tension and planting the seeds of comfort and trust. School offered new layers of observation. He noticed the ways students reacted to the same lesson, the flicker of hope in some eyes, the quiet defeat in others, the restless energy hidden beneath practiced smiles. He began extending subtle support, a nod of recognition, a whispered encouragement, a shared smile, gestures that left almost no trace to an outsider, yet had an enduring impact on the people they touched. His ability to sense and respond created connections that were invisible yet unshakable, small threads woven delicately into the fabric of others' lives. At home, the daily rituals became richer. He noticed the way his mother hummed while preparing meals, the tiny adjustments his father made to ensure comfort, the subtle coordination of their gestures and movements. These observations were lessons in attentiveness, demonstrations of care that did not demand recognition. He began to replicate them, shaping his own ways of offering presence and support. Even the smallest acts, pouring tea at just the right angle, setting a chair where it would be most useful, noticing the weight of silence in the room, became forms of quiet heroism, shaping the environment with gentle awareness. He also began to sense the emotional texture of spaces themselves. Rooms could carry memories like dust, thick with residue, or glow with warmth from laughter long past. Parks could hum with energy, tension, or calm depending on who was present. He learned to navigate these currents with care, adjusting his presence to harmonize rather than dominate. In doing so, he discovered that empathy was not limited to human hearts alone. The world itself had moods, subtle patterns, and quiet vulnerabilities that could be acknowledged and gently guided. His friendship with the girl grew deeper still. They developed intricate, unspoken rituals, a glance exchanged at the right moment, a tilt of the head, the way a hand could brush a shoulder with intent, a small smile that carried a message of reassurance. These gestures became their private language, a network of understanding that needed no words to be fully comprehended. Through this shared attentiveness, they strengthened one another, learning that connection is most profound when it is earned slowly, woven through daily acts of care and observation rather than grand declarations. He noticed, too, that subtle acts of empathy could resonate in unexpected places. Walking down a street, he could sense the heaviness carried by a shopkeeper or a neighbor. A quiet acknowledgement, a gentle smile, a simple nod. These tiny actions could shift the weight just enough to allow a moment of relief, a flicker of hope. He realized that influence is rarely dramatic, often imperceptible, and yet its impact can be enduring. Quiet attentiveness became a guiding principle, a way to move through the world with purpose without forcing it to bend to his will. He also discovered that introspection deepened his empathy. By observing his own emotions, moments of doubt, fear, or frustration, he learned to recognize them in others. He became patient not only with himself but with those around him, understanding that imperfection was natural, that growth was gradual, and that quiet support often mattered more than direct instruction or advice. In this, he found the beginnings of a philosophy. Life's quiet heroism exists in patience, attentiveness, and gentle guidance, and it unfolds slowly, often unseen. In the moments between moments. One afternoon, he sat by a riverbank, watching the sunlight scatter across the water in fractured gold. A small child approached, hesitant, clutching a stone in their tiny hand. The child seemed unsure, their eyes searching. He offered a gentle smile and waited, letting them approach at their own pace. When the child finally spoke, asking if they could skip the stone across the water, he nodded, showing them the motion without words. The child laughed as the stone bounced once, twice, and sank, and he felt a warmth ripple through him, the quiet satisfaction of influence, not through authority but through presence, patience, and attentiveness. Evenings became reflective periods, a time for contemplation and acknowledgement. He would sit by his window, listening to the neighborhood settling into quiet, the distant murmurs softening into night. He thought of the day's interactions, the subtle exchanges, the moments he had noticed, and those he had missed. He understood that even missed opportunities could teach, that imperfection was part of the rhythm, and that continued attentiveness, patience, and care created a tapestry of quiet heroism. The reflection itself became a ritual, a reinforcement of the gentle influence he carried into the world. He began noticing patterns in the flow of human emotion, in the way small gestures could ripple outward, creating unintended comfort or unease. A nod, a glance, a slight adjustment of posture. These tiny acts could resonate far beyond their immediate context. He experimented quietly, observing responses, refining his approach, and learning that influence is most profound when it is subtle, patient, and responsive. The lessons were cumulative, each interaction building on the last, weaving a network of understanding and care that stretched far beyond his immediate awareness. Friendships, family connections, and even casual encounters became exercises in mindfulness and empathy. He found joy in small acts of attentiveness, noticing when someone needed a chair moved, a burden carried, or a word spoken softly. The world had grown more intricate, layered, and alive with meaning, and he moved through it with increasing grace. His actions were not grand or celebrated, but they were consequential, rippling in quiet ways that shaped the lives of those around him, leaving traces of care that lingered long after he had passed through a space. As night drew near, he lay in bed, the soft glow of stars filtering through the window. He reflected on the currents of the day, the subtle gestures, the small acts of attention, the ripples of influence that moved invisibly through human hearts. He understood that life's quiet heroism existed in the consistency of care, in the patience to notice, in the willingness to act gently and thoughtfully, even when recognition was unlikely or impossible. In this awareness, he found peace. And as sleep approached, he allowed himself to rest in the certainty that the small acts of care, the quiet attentiveness, and the gentle guidance he carried were enough. The world would continue its slow, layered movement, but within it, the ripples of kindness and understanding he created would endure. Tomorrow he would continue to observe, to notice and to respond with quiet heroism, carrying the soft, luminous power of empathy, attention, and care into another day. The mornings had begun to feel almost sacred, carrying a soft, golden light that seemed to linger longer than before. He walked through streets that had become familiar, yet each day revealed something new, a subtle shift in the air, the faint rustle of leaves, the almost imperceptible hum of life stirring around him. These mornings felt like a gentle invitation, a quiet reminder that presence mattered, that noticing the world with care could uncover beauty hidden in plain sight. The rhythm of the day moved slowly, deliberately, as if waiting for him to catch each nuance, each delicate whisper of life. He had begun to notice how deeply his presence could influence others, not in loud gestures or proclamations, but in quiet ways. The gentle tilt of a head, a subtle smile, a patient pause before speaking. Each movement, each observation, each act of attentiveness carried weight. Friends began to lean on him without knowing why, drawn to his calm steadiness and subtle awareness. Strangers, too, felt the quiet reassurance in his presence, as though he carried a warmth that extended beyond intention, radiating softly, imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. School had become a laboratory for understanding human interaction. He watched as teachers and students alike moved through their routines, noticing patterns that others missed. He could feel anxiety ripple across the classroom, the undercurrent of hope in a raised hand, the faint tremor of excitement or fear in a glance. And he learned to act with precision. A word spoken softly, a nod at the right moment, a smile that lingered just long enough to be felt. The effects were subtle, almost invisible, but they left lasting impressions on those who experienced them. It was a quiet form of influence, yet one that mattered profoundly. Home offered lessons of a different kind. He noticed the rhythms in his family's interactions. The gentle sigh before speaking, the small movements of care that went unremarked, the way they anticipated each other's needs without words. He began to mirror these gestures, to weave attentiveness into the fabric of his own presence, setting the table just so, pouring a cup of tea at the exact moment it would be needed, noticing the weight of a sigh or the hesitation. In a glance, all became part of his growing understanding of how quiet heroism could be, expressed through observation and subtle action. He also became attuned to the emotional resonance of the spaces around him. A room could carry joy or sorrow, energy or fatigue, tension or relief. He could feel it in the way light fell, in the way sound traveled, in the almost imperceptible shifts in air and atmosphere. He learned to move within these spaces with care, to harmonize rather than disrupt, to offer subtle comfort and stability. The world itself seemed to respond, softening in his presence, revealing layers of meaning that had previously gone unnoticed. The friendship with the girl deepened in ways both simple and profound. They developed rituals of quiet communication, glances that carried reassurance, small touches that conveyed trust, shared silences that spoke louder than words. In these moments, he understood that connection was not measured by spectacle or volume, but by consistency, attentiveness, and subtle acknowledgement. They became mirrors for one another, reflecting understanding and care, teaching patience, and creating a sanctuary of mutual presence that neither had known they needed, but both had quietly relied upon. He discovered, too, that empathy could extend beyond humans. Animals, trees, even the subtle shifts of wind carried signals that he could sense and respond to. A stray cat, curled in a sunbeam, seemed to acknowledge his gentle gaze. The rustle of leaves whispered of passage and time. The way a shadow fell across the ground hinted at the lingering presence of memory. He learned to listen to these cues, to move in harmony with the broader currents of life, and to recognize that his influence was not limited to people alone, but extended to the quiet pulse of the world itself. One afternoon, he encountered a neighbor in distress. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she carried a basket, her face pale with concern, though she tried to mask it with a tight-lipped smile. He approached slowly, offering no words at first, only a steady presence and a gentle acknowledgement of her struggle. She looked up, surprised, and then allowed herself to release a small sigh, a fraction of her tension lifting in the shared quiet. He realized then that influence could be as simple as attention, as gentle as acknowledgement, and that these small gestures could ripple outward, affecting moments, days, and even lives in ways imperceptible to anyone but those who felt them. Evenings carried a reflective peace. He would sit by the window watching the shadows lengthen and the city settle into quiet. The hum of life softened, the distant laughter and footsteps receded, leaving behind only the gentle rhythm of night. In these moments, he allowed himself to contemplate the day's subtle acts, the small waves of influence, the quiet ripples of empathy that had passed through him. He understood that these ripples were cumulative, forming a tapestry of quiet heroism, patience, and care, even in the absence of recognition or reward. He began to notice patterns in how people responded to attention and care. A glance, a soft word, a small act could change the course of a conversation, the tone of a day, the atmosphere of a room. These patterns were intricate, delicate, and often invisible, yet they had profound consequences. He experimented with them, learning when to speak, when to remain silent, when to step forward, and when to hold back. Each interaction became a lesson in attentiveness, humility, and the gentle art of influence. His relationships continued to evolve. Friends, family, and even casual acquaintances seemed to sense the depth of his presence. They leaned on him, confided in him, and allowed themselves to be seen in ways they might not have otherwise. And he learned that this was not about him alone. It was about the reciprocal nature of attention, empathy, and presence. The more he gave, the more the world responded in kind, creating a web of subtle, enduring connections that could not be easily measured but could be deeply felt. As night approached, he reflected on the day's quiet triumphs, the gestures unnoticed by others, the moments of comfort offered and received, the subtle harmonies he had nurtured in the spaces around him. He understood that life's quiet heroism exists not in spectacle but in attentiveness, in patience, in the willingness to respond with care to the subtle needs of the world. These lessons became part of him, shaping how he moved, how he observed, and how he offered his presence to those who needed it. And as he lay down to rest, he felt the world exhale alongside him. The streets, the trees, the distant hum of life all seemed to fold gently into night, carrying with them the traces of his influence. Tomorrow would arrive with its own rhythms, its own lessons, and its own subtle opportunities for quiet heroism. He would continue to notice, to care, and to act with gentle awareness, carrying the luminous power of patience, attentiveness, and empathy into the day ahead. The mornings had begun to carry a softness that felt like a quiet promise. Sunlight spilled gently across rooftops, pooling in unexpected corners and casting long, slow shadows. He walked beneath it, letting each beam brush his skin, noticing the subtle interplay of light and shadow. The world felt alive in ways that were almost imperceptible, yet entirely present. Each sound, each movement, each small shift in the air seemed to carry meaning, and he had learned to move with awareness, letting observation become a form of quiet care. His empathy had deepened into something almost tangible. He could sense the slightest tremor of emotion in those around him, the undercurrent of anxiety in a friend's voice, the hidden sadness in a stranger's smile, the subtle tension in the air that accompanied unspoken worries. He learned to respond delicately, not with words alone, but with presence. A slow nod, a soft glance, a touch that lingered just long enough to offer reassurance without intrusion. These acts were invisible to most, yet they carried profound resonance, and he began to understand that influence often resides in the quietest gestures. School offered a continuing laboratory for understanding subtle human dynamics. He observed patterns in the classroom, the way excitement could ripple through a group, the slight tremor of hesitation before a question, the invisible weight of expectation pressing on classmates. His interventions were small, deliberate, and careful. A smile at the right moment, a nod of acknowledgement, a whispered word of encouragement. These acts created calm and connection without fanfare. He began to recognize that leadership could exist in quiet influence, in shaping the emotional landscape with patience and care rather than authority or spectacle. At home, the rhythm of attentive care continued. He noticed how his parents coordinated their gestures, how a simple glance or movement could communicate more than words. He mirrored these subtleties, integrating them into his own presence, pouring tea, adjusting chairs, attending to quiet sighs or pauses. These became acts of love, quiet heroism, and grounding that strengthened the fabric of daily life. Each act, small though it seemed, was imbued with intention, with care, and with the subtle magic of empathy made manifest in routine. He had also grown sensitive to the emotional resonance of spaces. A room could carry joy or sorrow, tension or comfort, almost like an unspoken memory. He learned to move through these spaces gently, harmonizing rather than disrupting, offering presence without imposing it. Even outside, the streets, the parks, and the alleys carried moods that he could feel. The quiet joy of laughter lingering on a breeze, the faint sadness in a corner where shadows hung heavier, the calm hum of a familiar pathway. His influence extended beyond human hearts into the very pulse of the world. His friendship with the girl continued to deepen, reaching layers that words could not fully capture. They developed a language of glances, small touches, and shared silences, each conveying more than could be spoken. Through these rituals, they strengthened each other's awareness and care, cultivating a sanctuary of trust and understanding. He learned that the strongest bonds are often forged in subtlety, in quiet attention, and in the patience to understand one another's rhythms without forcing expression or expectation. He began to notice the ripple effect of his empathy in unexpected places. A shopkeeper paused to return a glance, their tension softening in response to his calm presence. A neighbor's shoulders relaxed when he offered a small, wordless acknowledgement. Even the smallest interaction seemed capable of shifting emotional currents, altering moods, and planting seeds of ease. These moments were rarely recognized, but he felt their significance keenly. Quiet influence, he realized, is cumulative. Subtle gestures create lasting impressions that outlive the moment itself. One afternoon, he encountered a child sitting alone beneath a large maple tree, tracing patterns in the dirt with a small stick. The child's posture was tense, eyes cast downward, as though the weight of the world rested in a single moment. He approached without haste, letting his presence be a steady anchor. The child glanced up cautiously, and he offered only a small smile. Minutes passed in silence before the child spoke, asking to show him the drawings etched in the soil. He knelt beside the child, mirroring their gestures, acknowledging each mark with gentle attentiveness. By the time they parted, the tension in the child's shoulders had softened, a subtle shift that spoke of trust, quietly established without pressure or words. Evenings brought a sense of reflection and consolidation. He would sit by his window, watching the city exhale into the soft glow of night. The distant hum of traffic, the muted laughter of neighbors, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, all these became a soundtrack for quiet introspection. He thought of the day's interactions, both noticed and unnoticed, and recognized the patterns that emerged. Each act of attentiveness, each subtle gesture, had contributed to an invisible web of care, weaving connections that shaped the world in gentle, enduring ways. He noticed patterns in human interaction that revealed the intricate choreography of emotion. A simple adjustment of posture, a careful pause, a glance timed just right. These small acts could shift energy, ease tension, and foster connection. He experimented quietly, learning which gestures carried weight, which moments required patience, and which spaces needed only silent acknowledgement. In this subtle mastery, he discovered a rhythm, the interplay of awareness, empathy, and action that could guide others without force. creating influence that was invisible yet enduring. His relationships continued to flourish in the quiet. Friends, family, and acquaintances began to trust his presence, to lean on him without understanding why. His attentiveness, patience, and subtle guidance became a source of comfort, demonstrating the power of quiet influence. He realized that life's heroism does not require recognition, applause, or dramatic gestures. Instead, it resides in the consistency of care, in the patience to notice, and in the gentle willingness to act thoughtfully in response to subtle needs. As the night deepened, he reflected on the day's small triumphs, the subtle shifts in others, the quiet acknowledgement of unspoken needs, the gentle adjustments that rippled outward. He understood that influence and care do not require grandeur. Their power lies in their subtlety, in their patience, in the ability to create calm and trust through consistent, attentive presence. These lessons became woven into the fabric of his being, guiding him toward a life of quiet heroism and deep connection. And as sleep approached, he allowed himself to rest with the awareness that his small, attentive actions mattered. The world would continue its slow, layered unfolding, but within it, the ripples of kindness, understanding, and subtle influence he carried would endure. Tomorrow he would continue to notice, respond, and move gently through the currents of life, offering calm, care, and empathy wherever it was needed. The mornings had grown slower, the sunlight filtering through trees in gentle shafts that warmed the earth without haste. He walked through the streets with a practiced attention, noticing the subtle shifts in color, shadow, and sound. The world seemed to breathe with him, each movement a quiet rhythm that invited reflection. Even the simplest moments, a bird landing on a rooftop, the soft ripple of water in a fountain, a leaf drifting on the breeze, felt significant, as though the ordinary carried within it the extraordinary, waiting only for careful eyes and patient hearts to perceive it. His empathy had deepened into a resonance, an almost tactile awareness of the emotional currents surrounding him. He could feel tension in a room, the invisible weight of worry pressing on a person, the flicker of hope or doubt in fleeting expressions. He learned to respond delicately, offering presence rather than advice, acknowledgement rather than instruction. A nod, a glance, a quiet word, spoken at the right moment could shift the weight of the day for someone else, and he began to understand that the smallest gestures could carry immense significance when delivered with care and attention. At school, he noticed the unspoken choreography of interactions. Friends and classmates moved through their routines with subtle patterns of anticipation and response. He could sense when a smile hid sadness, when a voice trembled with hesitation, when a glance was an appeal for understanding. He intervened gently, offering recognition and reassurance in ways that were almost invisible, yet profoundly impactful. The classroom became a space where quiet influence shaped the emotional atmosphere, a living demonstration of how patience, attentiveness, and empathy could ripple through a group without fanfare or announcement. At home, the rhythm of life offered its own lessons. He observed the intricate coordination of his parents' gestures, the way a glance, a pause, or a small movement could communicate more than words. He mirrored these subtleties, integrating them into his own interactions. Pouring tea just so, adjusting a chair before it was needed, noticing the weight of silence. These small acts were a form of love, quiet heroism, and grounding. Each gesture carried intention, and each moment of attentiveness wove a stronger thread into the fabric of daily life. He became increasingly sensitive to the emotional resonance of spaces. A room could hold laughter long past, or carry the residue of sorrow like a faint perfume. Streets, parks, and gardens bore the moods of those who had passed through them, the echo of joy or tension lingering in ways that were almost imperceptible. He learned to navigate these currents with care, aligning himself with their rhythms, harmonizing rather than disrupting, offering quiet stability to those who might sense the imbalance but not understand its source. The world itself had a pulse, and he had become attuned to its subtle fluctuations. His friendship with the girl deepened into a sanctuary of unspoken understanding. They shared gestures, glances, touches, and silences that carried meaning beyond words. In these rituals, they nurtured each other's awareness, patience, and capacity for care. He realized that the strongest connections were often forged not through declarations or grand acts, but through consistent attention, small gestures, and shared moments of presence. Their bond became a quiet refuge, a space where empathy, attentiveness, and trust could grow undisturbed. He began to see the ripple effect of his influence in unexpected places. A passerby paused, a tense expression softening when he smiled quietly. A neighbor's shoulders relaxed when he lingered in acknowledgement. Even the smallest interaction seemed capable of shaping emotional currents, planting seeds of ease and comfort that could grow over time. The cumulative effect was subtle but profound. Tiny acts of care and presence accumulated into an invisible, enduring web of human connection, one that extended far beyond his immediate awareness. One afternoon, he encountered a young boy sitting beneath a sprawling oak tree, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. The boy's posture was tense, his gaze fixed downward, as if carrying the weight of the world. He approached slowly, allowing his presence to be a gentle anchor. The child lifted his eyes cautiously and he offered a small, patient smile. Minutes passed in quiet observation before the boy spoke, asking if he could show him the patterns he had drawn. He knelt beside him, following each motion, acknowledging every mark with gentle attentiveness. By the time they parted, the boy's tension had eased, and trust had quietly taken root. Influence, he understood, did not require words or urgency, only presence, patience, and care. Evenings became reflective periods, moments to consider the day's subtle triumphs. He would sit by his window, listening to the city settle into a soft lull, the distant murmur of voices fading into the hum of night. He thought of the small gestures of attentiveness, the interactions that left no trace but carried weight, the ripples of empathy that had moved unnoticed yet deeply through the day. In these reflections, he recognized the cumulative power of quiet influence, the endurance of gestures offered without expectation, and the profound impact of consistent care. He also noticed patterns in how people responded to attention and observation. A slight shift in posture, a timed pause, a glance at the right moment. These small acts could change a conversation, ease tension, and nurture connection. He practiced these subtleties deliberately, learning when to act, when to observe, and when to simply exist alongside others. Through this patient experimentation, he discovered the delicate rhythm of influence. Empathy and attentiveness could guide and comfort without commanding, creating change that was gentle, lasting, and invisible to anyone but those who experienced it directly. His relationships continued to grow in depth and subtlety. Friends, family, and casual acquaintances leaned on him without fully understanding why. His calm presence, gentle attention, and subtle interventions became a source of comfort, proof that quiet heroism resides not in spectacle, but in consistency, care, and the willingness to notice. He came to understand that life's most profound influence often occurs without recognition, in the patient weaving of connection through small, deliberate gestures that honor the emotional needs of others. As night approached, he reflected on the day's quiet victories, the shifts in others' moods, the trust quietly established, the gentle harmonies created in rooms, streets, and hearts. He understood that life's heroism does not demand recognition, applause, or dramatic gestures. It lives in attentiveness, patience, and the careful observation of the subtle, often overlooked moments. These lessons became a part of him, guiding his presence, his empathy, and his quiet ability to influence the world in enduring ways. And as sleep settled over the city, he allowed himself to rest in the certainty that his gentle attention and small acts of care were enough. The world would continue its slow, layered unfolding, but within it, the ripples of empathy, influence, and quiet heroism he carried would persist. Tomorrow would bring new moments, new opportunities for subtle guidance, and new ways to extend the luminous power of patience, attentiveness, and presence into the day. The mornings had begun to carry a softness that felt like a gentle exhale, as though the world itself was settling into quiet reflection. Sunlight spilled through the trees in long, warm shafts, glinting off dew that clung stubbornly to leaves and grass. He walked through the familiar streets with the ease of someone who had learned to notice the rhythm of the world. Each sound, each movement, each subtle shift of air seemed to carry meaning. He breathed slowly, letting the details settle into him, knowing that the world's smallest moments often held the most significance. His empathy had taken on new depth. He could feel the almost invisible threads connecting people, the silent hopes, the hidden worries, the lingering sorrow beneath practiced smiles. He responded with care that was never urgent, never demanding of attention, but always deliberate. A glance, a nod, a quiet word offered at the right moment could ripple through a room like a soft, invisible current. He had begun to understand that influence is most profound when it is patient, gentle, and unassuming, moving through the world quietly yet persistently. School remained a laboratory for subtle understanding. He noticed the microcosms of emotion in every classroom, the tiny interactions that carried more weight than the lessons themselves. A friend's fleeting hesitation, a classmate's suppressed frustration, a teacher's unspoken fatigue, all became data, patterns to observe, opportunities to offer subtle support. He learned to intervene without intrusion, a smile here, a whispered encouragement there, a nod that acknowledged unspoken feelings. These acts were invisible to the casual observer, yet their impact was undeniable to those who felt them. Home continued to offer lessons in quiet care. He observed the ways his parents communicated without words, the glance that reassured, the adjustment of a chair, the sigh of relief shared in silence. He mirrored these gestures, integrating them into his own attentiveness, pouring tea at just the right moment, noticing the weight of a pause, shifting small objects to ease daily life. Each act became an offering of love, subtle but essential. He began to understand that heroism often exists in these unnoticed, deliberate gestures, in the patient attentiveness woven into ordinary routines. He had grown more sensitive to the emotional resonance of spaces. Rooms carried echoes of memory, parks bore traces of laughter and sorrow, streets whispered of the countless lives that had moved through them. He learned to harmonize with these subtle currents, offering presence that soothed rather than disturbed. Even nature seemed to respond. The rustle of leaves, the ripple of water, the sway of branches, all felt like a conversation, a delicate exchange of awareness. His empathy was no longer limited to human hearts. It extended into the very pulse of the world. His friendship with the girl had matured into a quiet sanctuary of understanding. Words had become less important. Gestures, glances, touches, and shared silences conveyed a depth of trust and care that neither could fully articulate. In these moments, he realized that the strongest bonds are forged in subtlety, in patience, and in consistent attentiveness. They reflected each other's rhythms, offering comfort and understanding without needing to speak. Their connection had become a living thing, growing quietly and steadily, sustained by shared presence and mutual awareness. He began to perceive the ripple effects of his empathy beyond immediate interactions. A neighbor's shoulders relaxed when he lingered in acknowledgement. A stranger's frown softened in response to a gentle smile. Even the smallest gestures seemed capable of shifting emotional currents, planting seeds of trust and comfort that would grow slowly over time. These effects were rarely recognized, but he felt them deeply, understanding that the quiet, cumulative nature of influence was more enduring than any overt action could ever be. One afternoon, he came across a small group of children gathered in a park, their laughter mingling with the wind. One child had tripped and fallen, and a hush of concern spread through the group. He knelt beside the child, offering calm, steady reassurance. He did not rush, did not speak in haste, only allowed his presence to provide stability. The child looked up, their panic softening, and slowly returned to play. He watched the subtle shift in the group, the way tension dissolved, and understood that influence was not always visible, but always present when offered with patience and attentiveness. Evenings became a time for reflection. He would sit by the window listening to the city settle into quiet, the hum of distant voices fading into soft night air. He thought of the day's small victories, the unnoticed gestures, the subtle guidance offered and received, the quiet harmonies that had rippled through interactions and spaces. Each moment reinforced the understanding that heroism exists not in spectacle, but in the patient, consistent attention to the needs of others. Quiet influence, he realized, was a kind of stewardship, a gentle shaping of the world without ever needing to dominate it. He noticed patterns in human behavior with increasing clarity, a soft glance, a careful pause, a well-timed word. These small acts could shift moods, ease tension, and create connection. He experimented gently, learning when to act, when to observe, and when simply to exist alongside others. The lessons were subtle but cumulative. Over time, he understood the rhythm of empathy, noticing, acknowledging, responding, and then allowing the other person's space to unfold naturally. Influence required patience, and its power was magnified by restraint. His relationships flourished quietly. Friends, family, and neighbors began to lean on his presence without fully understanding why. They trusted the steady calm he offered, the patience he embodied, and the subtle guidance he provided. He understood that life's most profound impacts are often unseen, that the soft accumulation of care, attentiveness, and empathy creates ripples that endure far longer than any dramatic gesture. Heroism existed in consistency, in observing carefully, in offering presence when it was needed most, often without acknowledgement. As the night deepened, he reflected on the quiet triumphs of the day, the shifts in mood, the small gestures that had comforted and guided, the harmonies he had fostered in spaces and hearts. All reminded him that life's heroism exists in subtle, patient acts. It does not demand recognition or applause. It thrives in the everyday attentiveness that nurtures trust, empathy, and understanding. These lessons became part of him, shaping how he moved, how he observed, and how he offered care, and as sleep approached, he allowed himself to rest in the gentle knowledge that his quiet attentiveness, patience, and empathy were enough. The world would continue its slow, layered unfolding, but within it, the ripples of influence and care he carried would endure. Tomorrow he would continue to observe, to act with subtle guidance, and to offer the luminous power of quiet presence, patience, and attentiveness to all who crossed his path. The mornings had started to feel like soft awakenings, the sun spilling in long, gentle beams that seemed to settle over the rooftops and streets like a warm sigh. He walked beneath it, feeling the slow rhythm of the world around him, noticing the subtle shifts in light and shadow, the almost imperceptible sounds of life waking. Even the faint rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, or the soft murmur of water in a gutter felt meaningful, like quiet invitations to pay attention. The ordinary had begun to shimmer with significance, and he moved with a patient awareness that allowed each detail to speak to him softly. His empathy had grown into a quiet resonance, a sensitivity that made him attuned to even the smallest emotional tremors in those around him. He could sense the flicker of anxiety in a friend's hesitation, the weight of unspoken sorrow in a stranger's glance, or the subtle undercurrent of hope in a fleeting smile. He responded with gentle care, not pressing, not announcing, only offering presence. A nod, a soft word, a quiet smile. Each gesture had the power to ripple outward, easing tension and planting seeds of reassurance. He was learning more and more that influence comes not from volume or insistence, but from patient attentiveness. School had become a space where he honed this quiet guidance. He noticed the intricate currents of interaction among students, the subtle exchanges of attention, the hidden rhythms of group dynamics, a glance, a shared understanding, a whispered encouragement. These small, almost imperceptible gestures could change the atmosphere of a classroom. He realized that leadership did not require authority or spectacle. It existed in the capacity to notice, to respond, and to create calm where there had been tension. He began to see his presence as a gentle shaping force, an influence that moved quietly through the spaces he inhabited. At home, his attentiveness deepened. He observed the way his parents coordinated without words, the slight shifts in posture or gaze that communicated comfort, care, or understanding. He mirrored these subtleties, offering presence through small acts, adjusting a chair, preparing tea just in time, noticing the pauses in conversation, recognizing the weight of silence. These gestures, though simple, became acts of love, quiet heroism woven into the fabric of daily life. He began to understand that true influence often goes unnoticed, existing in the patient attentiveness that makes life smoother and lighter for those around him. He had also begun to sense the emotional textures of spaces. Rooms could carry joy or sorrow, tension or relief, and he moved through them with gentle care. Parks, streets, and alleys carried echoes of the people who had been there before. Laughter, sadness, quiet reflection. He learned to harmonize with these currents, offering a steady presence that did not disturb, but allowed subtle shifts toward calm and balance. Even nature responded to his attentiveness. The sway of trees, the rustle of grass, the soft ripple of water seemed to engage in a quiet dialogue, and he moved with it, attentive to its rhythms. His friendship with the girl had become a sanctuary of understanding and trust. Words mattered less than glances, gestures, and shared silences. In these unspoken rituals, they cultivated patience, empathy, and mutual care. They reflected one another's needs and rhythms, offering support without expectation, understanding without declaration. Their bond was quiet but profound, built on attentiveness and consistent presence, teaching him that the most enduring relationships often flourish in subtlety, through repeated acts of consideration and care rather than dramatic gestures. He noticed the ripple effects of his quiet influence in everyday life. A neighbor's frown softened when he lingered in acknowledgement. A stranger's shoulders eased with a quiet smile. Even the smallest interactions carried the capacity to shift emotional currents, planting seeds of ease and reassurance. These ripples were rarely recognized, but he felt their significance deeply. Over time, he understood that life's quiet heroism is cumulative. Tiny acts of attentiveness grow into enduring networks of care, trust, and empathy that extend far beyond immediate observation. One afternoon, he encountered a child sitting alone under a wide-branched oak, drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. The child's posture was tense, their gaze focused downward. He approached slowly, letting his presence be an anchor. The child looked up cautiously and he offered a gentle smile. Minutes passed in silence before the child asked to show him the drawings. He knelt beside them, mirroring their movements and acknowledging each mark with quiet attentiveness. By the time they parted, The child's tension had softened, and a small trust had taken root. Influence, he realized, is not about words or urgency, but about patient, steady presence. Evenings became a time for reflection. He sat by his window, watching the city settle into quiet, listening to the hum of life soften. He thought of the subtle victories of the day, the unnoticed gestures, the quiet encouragement, the emotional shifts that had occurred without announcement. Each small action was a thread woven into a larger tapestry, a pattern of influence and care that quietly shaped the world around him. He recognized the cumulative power of attentiveness, the lasting impact of patience, and the gentle artistry of empathy expressed without fanfare. He also began to notice patterns in human behavior and emotional response. A glance, a pause, a word, spoken softly. These gestures could change the flow of a day, alter tension, or foster connection. He experimented with timing and subtlety, learning when to act, when to observe, and when to simply be present. Through these careful observations, he understood the rhythm of influence, noticing, acknowledging, responding, and allowing space for others to move naturally. Patience magnified the power of empathy, and subtle acts of attentiveness could quietly transform lives over time. His relationships deepened in quiet ways. Friends, family, and neighbors came to trust his presence, relying on the calm steadiness he offered without fully understanding why. They leaned on him because of the way he listened, observed, and responded with care. He understood that life's most profound heroism often exists without recognition, in patient, deliberate attention to the needs of others. The small, consistent gestures of empathy and awareness create lasting impact, shaping connections that endure far beyond a single moment. As night fell, he reflected on the day's subtle achievements, the soft shifts in people's moods, the quiet trust established, the gentle harmonies fostered in spaces and hearts. He understood that heroism is rarely dramatic. It resides in patience, attentiveness, and the willingness to notice. The lessons of quiet influence, of steady care and thoughtful presence had become part of him, shaping not only how he moved through the world, but also how he offered himself to others. And as sleep approached, he rested in the awareness that his gentle attentiveness, empathy, and patience were enough. The world would continue its slow, layered unfolding, but the ripples of influence he carried would persist. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for quiet guidance, new chances to notice, respond, and offer subtle care. And he would move through it with the same gentle, luminous awareness that had carried him this far. The mornings had begun to feel like gentle awakenings, as if the world itself were breathing softly through him. Sunlight spilled across rooftops and streets, casting long, warm streaks of gold that lingered in corners and along edges. He walked beneath it slowly, noticing the subtle glint of dew on leaves, the whisper of wind through trees, and the soft murmur of life settling into its rhythm. Each detail seemed alive, resonant with quiet meaning. He realized that noticing, truly noticing, was itself a kind of care, a quiet acknowledgement that the world and its people mattered. His empathy had evolved into a kind of resonance that reached beyond simple understanding. He could feel the unspoken currents of emotion in those around him, a friend's hidden hesitation, a stranger's momentary tension, the faint trace of hope or fear lingering behind a glance. He learned to respond with presence rather than words, with gentle acknowledgement rather than instruction. A smile, a nod, a quiet word at precisely the right moment could ripple through the world like an invisible current, subtle yet enduring. He understood now that influence does not demand recognition. Its power lies in patience, care, and the ability to remain steady in the midst of unspoken emotion. School continued to be a place of delicate practice. He noticed the micro patterns of human interaction, the shifts of posture, the fleeting expressions the unspoken communications between classmates and teachers. He intervened softly, offering encouragement through attentiveness rather than overt action. A glance here, a quiet word there, a pause that allowed someone space to be themselves. These small acts reshaped the classroom atmosphere in ways that were invisible but deeply felt. Leadership, he realized, did not require authority or drama. It existed in consistent patient presence and the quiet shaping of emotional currents. At home, the rhythms of life offered lessons in subtle care. He observed the way his parents communicated without words, through slight gestures, careful timing, and shared attention. He mirrored these practices, pouring tea at the right moment, adjusting chairs, noticing the weight of silence, or offering a comforting look when it was needed most. These small acts became threads in the fabric of care and love, quiet heroism embedded in daily routines. He understood that heroism is not always loud or visible. Often, it exists in the patient, unnoticed attentiveness that shapes life for others in profound ways. He had grown increasingly sensitive to the emotional resonance of spaces. Rooms carried echoes of laughter, sorrow, and memory. Streets and parks held the imprints of countless lives, the subtle traces of joy, worry, and reflection. He learned to move in harmony with these currents, offering presence that neither disrupted nor imposed, but gently nurtured balance and calm. Even the natural world seemed to respond. The sway of branches, the rustle of leaves, and the ripple of water all seemed to engage in a quiet dialogue. He moved with attentiveness, aligning with these rhythms and contributing to the soft harmony around him. His friendship with the girl had become a sanctuary of unspoken understanding. Words mattered less than glances, gestures, touches, and shared silences. Through these small rituals, they cultivated trust, patience, and mutual care. Each reflected the other's needs and rhythms without expectation, creating a bond that was quiet but enduring. The strongest connections, he realized, are forged not through grand gestures or declarations, but through the consistent attentiveness and gentle presence that communicates, without words, that the other person matters. He began to notice the cumulative impact of his influence. A neighbor's frown softened when he lingered in quiet acknowledgement. A stranger's tension eased under a simple, steady glance. Small, seemingly inconsequential gestures carried the capacity to shift emotional currents, planting seeds of calm and reassurance that would grow over time. Though these effects were rarely acknowledged, he felt them keenly, understanding that quiet heroism is cumulative. It accrues through consistent care, patience and empathy extending far beyond immediate perception. One afternoon, he encountered a child sitting beneath an oak tree, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. The child's shoulders were tense, eyes downcast, as if carrying invisible burdens. He approached slowly, offering nothing but his presence. The child looked up, surprised, and he smiled gently. Minutes passed in silence before the child spoke, asking to show the patterns. He knelt beside them, mirroring their movements, acknowledging every mark with quiet attentiveness. By the time they parted, the child's tension had eased, a subtle trust had taken root. He understood that influence does not require urgency or words. It exists in patient, consistent presence. Evenings were moments of reflection and exhale. He would sit by the window, listening to the city settle into quiet, the distant hum of life softening. He considered the day's small triumphs, the unnoticed gestures, the subtle encouragements, the emotional shifts that had occurred without recognition. Each moment was a thread in a larger tapestry, a quiet network of influence and care that extended beyond what could be seen. He understood the cumulative power of patience, attentiveness, and empathy, and he allowed these reflections to settle gently within him. He also observed the patterns of human behavior, the intricate choreography of emotion. A glance, a pause, a softly spoken word. These small actions could reshape moods, ease tension, and foster connection. He experimented with timing and subtlety, learning when to act, when to observe, and when simply to exist alongside others. The rhythm of influence became apparent, noticing, acknowledging, responding, and then allowing space for natural movement. The power of patience magnified the effects of empathy, creating small, enduring shifts that would unfold over time. His relationships deepened through quiet attention. Friends, family, and neighbors leaned on him without always knowing why, trusting the steady calm he offered. His presence, patience, and subtle guidance were more powerful than any overt act, teaching him that life's most enduring heroism often exists without recognition. Small, consistent gestures of care and attentiveness create ripples that endure far longer than dramatic acts. He came to understand that influence and heroism are measured not in spectacle, but in constancy, empathy, and quiet attentiveness. As the night deepened, he reflected on the day's subtle victories. He considered the shifts in people's moods, the quiet trust that had been established, the harmonies created in spaces and hearts. He understood that heroism is rarely dramatic. It resides in patience, attentiveness, and consistent care. These lessons had become woven into his being, shaping the way he moved, observed, and offered himself to the world, and as sleep approached, he allowed himself to rest with the awareness that his quiet attentiveness, empathy, and patience were enough. The world would continue its slow, layered unfolding, but the ripples of care, influence, and quiet heroism he had nurtured would persist. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to notice, respond, and act with gentle awareness, carrying the luminous power of empathy, patience, and attentiveness into the day. And so the days, the quiet gestures, and the subtle ripples of care and presence folded into one another, forming a tapestry that stretched far beyond what could be seen or measured. Life moved on in its slow, layered rhythm, yet the echoes of attentiveness, empathy, and quiet heroism lingered, in smiles, in glances, in small acts of kindness. He had grown not through spectacle, but through patience, observation, and love, not through dramatic feats, but through the steady presence that nurtures and uplifts. And in this, the world itself seemed to breathe a little easier, carrying forward the calm and warmth that had passed through him. The story does not end here, for such quiet influence is never finished. It continues in the moments we touch without knowing, in the care we offer without applause, in the presence we give without expectation. It is alive in the spaces between us and in the way we move through the world with attention, patience, and heart. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well.
Everything's gonna be okay, man.